Historic return, Netherlands to repatriate, 119. Benin Bronzes to Nigeria, a step toward cultural justice. Welcome to the Bold African Voice, BAV, your platform for bold, insightful, and thought-provoking analysis on African culture, politics, and history. Today, we bring you a historic story of cultural reclamation as the Netherlands agrees to return 119 Benin Bronzes to Nigeria. This is a major milestone in Africa's ongoing fight for cultural justice and sovereignty, and we're here to break down the significance, compare it to other restitution efforts across the continent, and explore what this means for Africa's future. Stay tuned, like, share, and subscribe for more engaging content. The return of the Benin Bronzes to Nigeria marks a pivotal moment in the ongoing global conversation about the restitution of looted cultural heritage. On February 19, 2025, the Netherlands announced it would return 119 Benin Bronzes to Nigeria, representing the largest single restitution of Benin antiquities linked to the British punitive expedition of 1897. This momentous act underscores the growing importance of acknowledging colonial wrongdoings and redressing historical injustices, particularly regarding African cultural treasures. The significance of the Benin Bronzes. The Benin Bronzes are a collection of plaques, sculptures, and other artifacts that were looted from Benin City, modern-day Nigeria, during the British military invasion in 1897. The artifacts were subsequently dispersed to various global institutions, with many ending up in Europe, particularly in British museums. These bronzes, known for their intricate artistry and cultural significance, hold deep meaning for the people of Benin and Nigeria. They are not mere artifacts. They are the embodiment of a history that was violently disrupted and displaced by colonial forces. The restitution of these items comes after decades of advocacy by Nigeria and other African nations, demanding the return of cultural treasures taken during colonial times. Nigeria has long been at the forefront of these efforts, with the Benin Bronzes as one of its most high-profile cases. The Dutch role in the restitution process. The Netherlands' decision to return 119 Benin Bronzes is a major step in the growing movement for the return of looted African heritage. This move follows the request of the Nigerian government, supported by an independent expert committee that recommended the restitution. The return of these objects underscores the Dutch commitment to redressing historical wrongs and their policy on returning objects that were taken during the colonial era. The Dutch government has made it clear that the restitution is not conditional. In a statement, the Netherlands confirmed that the Benin Bronzes were looted during the British attack on Benin City in 1897 and should never have been taken to the Netherlands. Dutch Minister of Education, Culture and Science, Eppo Bruins, emphasized that the action was part of the broader effort to address a historical injustice that continues to affect people in both Nigeria and across Africa. This restitution contributes to redressing a historical injustice that is still being felt today, Bruins remarked. Cultural heritage is essential for telling and living the history of a country and a community. The Benin Bronzes are indispensable to Nigeria. It is good that they are going back. A long time coming. Nigeria's persistent advocacy. Nigeria has been advocating for the return of the Benin Bronzes for over 50 years, and this achievement reflects the culmination of persistent diplomatic efforts. Ambassador-designate of the Netherlands to Nigeria, Mr. Bengt van Loosdrecht, highlighted Nigeria's leadership in the global push for the return of looted artifacts, noting, "We congratulate Nigeria for being at the forefront of efforts to reclaim colonial looted art. Nigeria's Ministry of Culture, the National Commission for Museums and Monuments, NCMM, and several international organizations have played key roles in raising awareness about the need for repatriation." Director General of the NCMM, Olegbili Holloway, expressed the importance of this restitution, calling it the single largest return of Benin antiquities from a colonial context. The 119 objects, comprising 113 pieces from the Dutch state collection and 6 from the municipality of Rotterdam, will soon be sent back to Nigeria. Holloway thanked the Netherlands for its cooperation emphasizing that this return could set an example for other nations holding looted African artifacts. He stated, "We hope this will set a good example for other nations of the world in terms of repatriation of lost or looted antiquities." A broader context, Africa and the Restitution movement. The Benin Bronzes are part of a larger global movement to return cultural property that was looted during the colonial era. In recent years, more and more museums and governments have recognized the need to return African artifacts taken during colonial rule. The British Museum, for instance, holds numerous objects that many African countries, including Nigeria, have requested to be returned, yet the museum has often been resistant to such claims. This ongoing battle highlights the broader issues of cultural ownership, the legacy of colonialism, and the power dynamics between former colonizers and the countries they once subjugated. The return of the Benin Bronzes is significant not only for Nigeria, but for Africa as a whole. It demonstrates the power of diplomatic pressure and advocacy in the 21st century and signals a shift in global attitudes toward the repatriation of cultural heritage. It is a step toward rectifying the historical inequalities that were created during the colonial period and empowering African nations to reclaim their cultural identity and heritage. Global implications, setting a precedent for other nations. While Nigeria's success in retrieving the Benin Bronzes is a triumph, it also underscores the need for continued efforts in the repatriation of looted African heritage. The return of the Benin Bronzes from the Netherlands is just one part of a larger global conversation about the ownership and rightful location of cultural artifacts. Many other African nations are now closely following Nigeria's example, seeking to recover their cultural heritage from museums and institutions in Europe and beyond. One such example is the recent movement in France to return looted artifacts to African countries, particularly from French museums. In 2021, French President Emmanuel Macron announced a commitment to return thousands of African artifacts to their home countries, and discussions have been ongoing about the process of repatriation. Similarly, the return of sacred objects by the British Museum and other institutions has become a focal point in the decolonization of museum collections. As we look ahead, the return of the Benin Bronzes could inspire more nations to demand the return of their own looted cultural property, and it is likely that the global momentum for restitution will continue to grow. The Netherlands' action demonstrates that countries can engage in a cooperative, transparent process to address historical wrongs, paving the way for broader international dialogue about cultural restitution. The restitution of the Benin Bronzes also highlights the importance of museums and cultural institutions as spaces for dialogue, cooperation, and cultural exchange. While these institutions have often been seen as repositories of global cultural heritage, their role in perpetuating colonial legacies has come under scrutiny in recent years. The Netherlands has emphasized that this restitution is not the end of cooperation, but the beginning of a deeper partnership with Nigeria. The Dutch Wereld Museum, which had previously displayed the Benin Bronzes, expressed its willingness to continue collaborating with Nigerian museums to facilitate further exchanges and foster mutual understanding. Looking forward, the role of education and cultural diplomacy. As the Benin Bronzes make their way back to Nigeria, the implications of this restitution go beyond the artifacts themselves. This event represents a deeper conversation about the relationship between African nations and their historical narratives. The restitution of cultural artifacts is not just about returning objects. It is about restoring dignity, pride, and a sense of ownership over cultural identity. For Nigeria, the return of the Benin Bronzes offers an opportunity for further education and cultural engagement. The artifacts will be placed in Nigerian museums where they can be studied, preserved, and celebrated by future generations. These objects will continue to tell the story of Benin and Nigeria, contributing to the ongoing process of healing and reconciliation. The Benin Bronzes return is not just an isolated event, but a sign of hope for African nations striving to reclaim their cultural legacies. As Nigeria has demonstrated, cultural diplomacy, combined with a relentless pursuit of justice, can lead to meaningful change. This marks the beginning of a new chapter in the global movement for cultural restitution, and Nigeria's role in this movement will undoubtedly inspire future generations to continue the fight for justice and cultural heritage. The role of museums and global advocacy. The return of the Benin Bronzes is not only a victory for Nigeria, but also a lesson for the global museum community. Museums worldwide have long been the custodians of colonial-era artifacts, many of which were acquired through dubious or outright violent means. The Benin Bronzes are a case in point. Their looting during the 1897 British punitive expedition exemplifies the violent extraction of African cultural heritage by colonial powers. This restitution, however, signals a changing tide in how museums and governments view their responsibilities in dealing with such artifacts. Global advocacy, led by organizations such as the Africa Restitution Movement, has played a crucial role in increasing awareness and mobilizing support for the repatriation of stolen cultural treasures. These efforts have prompted a rethinking of the role of museums in preserving heritage. Rather than being merely places that house cultural objects, museums should now see themselves as stewards of knowledge and culture, with a duty to respect the countries of origin by returning objects that were taken without consent. The return of the Benin Bronzes can serve as a model for other museums holding African objects looted during the colonial period. It is essential for these institutions to engage in a transparent dialogue with countries of origin and work collaboratively to determine the most ethical and respectful means of returning cultural artifacts. As seen with the Dutch example, restitution does not need to be a contentious process, but rather an opportunity for cultural collaboration and healing. This paradigm shift in the global museum community also brings to light the need for further reforms in museum practices. Museums should not only return looted objects, but also ensure that African voices are represented in decisions about how these objects are displayed, interpreted, and contextualized. The process of repatriation, therefore, should go hand in hand with the promotion of African scholarship and the integration of indigenous perspectives into the narratives that museums tell. Impact on Nigeria's cultural landscape. The return of the Benin Bronzes has profound implications for Nigeria's cultural and national identity. For decades, these artifacts have been displayed in foreign museums, far removed from their cultural and historical context. Their return will allow Nigerians to reconnect with their heritage and give the people of Benin City, in particular, a sense of ownership over these priceless cultural treasures. Nigeria's National Commission for Museums and Monuments, NCMM, will play a pivotal role in safeguarding and showcasing the Benin Bronzes upon their arrival. The objects will be exhibited in Nigerian museums, where they can be studied, admired, and celebrated by future generations. This is not just a symbolic gesture of reclaiming heritage, it is an opportunity for cultural regeneration, where Nigerians can engage with their history on their own terms. Moreover, the return of these artifacts could have a lasting impact on Nigeria's tourism sector. As global interest in African heritage continues to grow, the Benin Bronzes will likely become a major draw for tourists, both domestic and international. This could lead to increased investment in Nigeria's cultural infrastructure, as the country builds on the momentum of this historic restitution to enhance its museums and cultural institutions. Lessons for Africa and the Global South. The return of the Benin Bronzes offers significant lessons not only for African nations, but also for the wider Global South. It highlights the importance of standing united in the face of historical injustice, advocating for the return of looted cultural property, and asserting the rights of countries to reclaim their heritage. Nigeria's long-standing struggle to bring the Benin Bronzes back home has been a testament to the power of perseverance, diplomatic negotiation, and the strength of national pride. For other African nations with similar claims to cultural treasures, Nigeria's success provides a blueprint for action. The African Union, AU, and other regional organizations, could play a pivotal role in supporting countries' efforts to recover looted artifacts. By creating a unified strategy for repatriation, African countries could amplify their collective voices in global forums, making it harder for museums and governments to ignore their demands for justice. Furthermore, the return of the Benin Bronzes could serve as a catalyst for deeper cooperation between African nations and former colonial powers. While the restitution of cultural property is a key issue, it is also an opportunity to address broader questions of economic, political, and social relationships between Africa and the global North. The reparative efforts involved in cultural restitution should be viewed as part of a wider conversation about redressing the legacies of colonialism and fostering more equitable relationships in the 21st century. The future of repatriation, a forward-looking approach. As the Benin Bronzes are set to return to Nigeria, this historic development should not be seen as the culmination of the restitution movement, but as a stepping stone toward a more equitable future. It is imperative that African nations and global institutions work together to ensure that the repatriation of looted cultural heritage is not an isolated event, but part of an ongoing process. Looking forward, there is a need for comprehensive legal frameworks that facilitate the restitution of cultural artifacts. Many European countries, including the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, still hold vast collections of African art and artifacts, many of which were taken during the colonial period. A global, coordinated effort to return these objects would not only restore cultural heritage, but also contribute to the process of healing and reconciliation between former colonial powers and African countries. Additionally, there is a growing movement to address the economic and social consequences of colonialism through reparations. The return of cultural objects can be seen as one aspect of a larger conversation about how to remedy the historical injustices that continue to impact African nations. This could include the redistribution of wealth, investments in African economies, and greater political autonomy for African countries in the global arena. It is also important to note that the Benin Bronzes return does not mark the end of the struggle for African cultural property. As the debate over repatriation continues, it will be crucial to address the challenges of preserving and protecting returned artifacts. The infrastructure in many African countries may not be equipped to handle the influx of looted treasures, and efforts must be made to improve museum security, conservation techniques, and staff training. The return of the Benin Bronzes is thus part of a broader call for justice, equity, and reconciliation. As more countries join the movement for repatriation, the global cultural landscape will continue to evolve, with African nations playing an increasingly significant role in shaping the future of cultural heritage. A new era of cultural reclamation. The return of the Benin Bronzes to Nigeria represents a significant milestone in the ongoing struggle for the restitution of African cultural property. It is a moment of triumph for Nigeria and the wider African continent, signaling the beginning of a new era of cultural reclamation. This historic event exemplifies the power of diplomatic cooperation, long-standing advocacy, and a commitment to justice. However, it also serves as a reminder that the journey is far from over. As the Benin Bronzes return to Nigeria, they will undoubtedly inspire a new generation of activists, scholars, and policymakers to continue the fight for the repatriation of looted African heritage. This victory is not just a victory for Nigeria, it is a victory for Africa and all countries that have been deprived of their cultural heritage through colonial exploitation. The return of these artifacts is a powerful step in the ongoing effort to right the wrongs of the past and to build a future where cultural justice is a reality for all. Expanding the scope of restitution, a global movement. The return of the Benin Bronzes highlights a key issue in global cultural politics, the need for systemic reform in the handling of colonial-era artifacts. While the Dutch action is commendable, it is crucial to acknowledge that many more artifacts remain scattered across museums and private collections around the world. These objects continue to be part of the collections of European, American, and Asian institutions, where they are often showcased without context or acknowledgement of their colonial origins. The Benin Bronzes return is not a singular event, but part of a larger ongoing conversation about the legacy of colonialism. This conversation has been amplified in recent years through the work of African scholars, activists, and cultural leaders who are calling for the repatriation of all cultural artifacts looted during the colonial period. These leaders argue that repatriation is not just about returning objects. It is about restoring dignity, historical truth, and cultural identity to African peoples who have been subjected to centuries of exploitation. The role of international organizations. International organizations like UNESCO, the International Council of Museums, ICOM, and the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, have long advocated for the protection and preservation of cultural heritage. These organizations have worked on initiatives to address the issue of looted antiquities and have provided a platform for African nations to voice their demands. In recent years, these bodies have also been instrumental in facilitating the return of looted cultural property to African nations. For instance, UNESCO has been involved in the creation of guidelines and frameworks for repatriation, ensuring that there is a legal and ethical basis for returning stolen cultural property. The organization has also encouraged the establishment of bilateral agreements between countries to foster cooperation in the return of looted heritage. These efforts are essential in establishing a more transparent and fair system for the restitution of cultural objects, which should not only focus on returning artifacts but also on supporting capacity building in countries of origin. Furthermore, UNESCO's role is vital in helping countries protect their cultural heritage from future looting and illegal trade. As African nations continue to reclaim their heritage, there is a pressing need to establish robust systems of governance, conservation, and education to protect these objects from further harm. This should include investment in local expertise, including archaeologists, historians, curators, and museum professionals, who can take the lead in preserving the artifacts for future generations. African governments, catalysts for change. While international organizations play a key role in advocating for restitution, it is the African governments and their leadership that remain the central driving force behind the movement for the return of looted cultural property. Nigeria's persistent efforts to recover the Benin Bronzes exemplify how a government can galvanize support, both at home and abroad, for the restitution of cultural artifacts. The Nigerian government has been proactive in using diplomatic channels to press its case for the return of the Benin Bronzes. The country's political leadership, including President Muhammadu Buhari and the Ministry of Culture, have engaged with foreign governments and institutions to push for the repatriation of stolen artifacts. In 2019, Buhari himself advocated for the return of the Benin Bronzes during his speech at the United Nations, emphasizing that the artifacts were an integral part of Nigeria's cultural and historical identity. Nigeria's diplomatic efforts are supported by the National Commission for Museums and Monuments, NCMM, which has played a key role in the advocacy process. The NCMM works closely with international partners, including the British Museum, to negotiate the return of artifacts. In this regard, the partnership with the Netherlands is a significant breakthrough, and Nigeria's engagement with other nations can serve as a model for other African governments seeking to reclaim their cultural heritage. Moreover, African governments must continue to work together to strengthen regional and continental efforts for restitution. The African Union, AU, can play an instrumental role in creating a unified front in pushing for the return of looted cultural property. The AU's ability to coordinate and facilitate discussions between African nations, as well as with international stakeholders, will be key to achieving comprehensive and fair restitution across the continent. The economic and social impact of repatriation. The return of cultural artifacts, such as the Benin Bronzes, is not only an issue of cultural significance, but also has economic and social implications for the nations receiving them. The Benin Bronzes are likely to have a substantial impact on Nigeria's tourism industry. attracting both domestic and international visitors eager to experience these priceless cultural treasures. The return of these objects can serve as a tool for economic development, creating job opportunities and boosting local economies through tourism, education, and cultural exchanges. By drawing attention to Nigeria's rich cultural heritage, the Benin Bronzes return also provides an opportunity for the country to showcase its artistic traditions and historical significance on the global stage. In addition, it creates an avenue for educational institutions in Nigeria to engage with students, scholars, and researchers who are interested in the country's history and culture. The return of these artifacts serves as a tool for fostering pride, national identity, and cultural continuity, helping to reshape the narrative about African history and achievements. Moreover, the repatriation of the Benin Bronzes opens doors for cultural diplomacy, where countries like Nigeria can use their cultural heritage to forge stronger relationships with other nations. By emphasizing the shared responsibility of preserving and celebrating cultural heritage, Nigeria can engage in deeper diplomatic and cultural exchanges with countries that are returning artifacts. These exchanges can promote mutual understanding and create partnerships in areas such as education, art, and history. Challenges ahead: preservation and protection. While the return of the Benin Bronzes is a moment of great achievement, there are challenges that Nigeria must address as these artifacts are brought back to their rightful home. One of the major concerns is the preservation and protection of these items once they are returned. Nigeria's museums and cultural institutions must be adequately equipped to store, conserve, and display these artifacts in ways that ensure their longevity. The infrastructure of Nigerian museums, including the National Museum in Benin City, must be strengthened to handle the influx of artifacts. Investments in modern conservation facilities, security systems, and trained personnel will be critical to ensuring that these cultural treasures are preserved for future generations. The Nigerian government will need to work in close collaboration with international experts and institutions to ensure that conservation efforts are world-class and sustainable. Furthermore, Nigeria will need to address the issue of cultural tourism in a way that does not jeopardize the preservation of these precious objects. There must be a balance between making these artifacts accessible to the public while also safeguarding them from potential damage, theft, or environmental harm. Educational programs, both locally and internationally, will be essential to raise awareness about the importance of preserving these cultural items and ensuring their responsible display. Looking forward, the future of African heritage. The return of the Benin Bronzes is a groundbreaking step forward in the quest for the restitution of looted African heritage, but it is by no means the end of the journey. African nations, with Nigeria at the forefront, must continue to press for the return of other looted artifacts and work to ensure that the restitution process is fair, transparent, and just. The global community must also step up to acknowledge the enduring impact of colonialism and the ways in which it continues to shape the cultural, economic, and political landscape of Africa. Restitution is not just a matter of returning stolen goods. It is a symbolic act that challenges the power structures of colonial legacy and asserts the dignity of African nations and peoples. As more African countries engage in the fight for cultural restitution, the return of the Benin Bronzes will stand as a beacon of hope and a model of how the restitution process can be conducted with respect, cooperation, and mutual understanding. This ongoing effort to reclaim African heritage is not only about recovering lost objects, it is about restoring Africa's rightful place in the global cultural conversation, affirming the value of its history, and ensuring that the voices of its people are heard. A ripple effect. The broader significance of the Benin Bronzes return. As the Benin Bronzes make their way back to Nigeria, this landmark restitution has already begun to inspire similar efforts across the African continent. Nigeria's success provides a valuable example of how cultural diplomacy, persistence, and collaboration can lead to tangible outcomes. The return of these artifacts could prompt other African countries with similar claims to expedite their own efforts for the repatriation of looted cultural heritage. Other African nations have long been at the forefront of demanding the return of their cultural treasures. Countries such as Ethiopia, Kenya, and Egypt have made concerted efforts to recover artifacts that were taken during colonial times. Ethiopia, for instance, has repeatedly called for the return of its sacred religious artifacts, including the tablet, which was looted during the 1868 British expedition to Magdala. Similarly, Kenya has sought the return of its cultural property, including artifacts taken during British colonial rule and subsequent exhibitions. This broader movement toward restitution can be framed within the context of the global push for decolonization and the acknowledgement of colonial-era injustices. African nations are not simply looking to recover objects. They are reclaiming a part of their history that was stolen from them. The significance of this movement extends beyond the objects themselves. It is about reclaiming agency, asserting cultural sovereignty, and rewriting the narrative that has historically marginalized African contributions to global civilization. The role of African diaspora communities. In addition to efforts by African governments, African diaspora communities have also played a significant role in advocating for the return of looted cultural property. African diaspora organizations, especially those based in the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, have been vocal in their support for repatriation. These communities often serve as bridges between African nations and the institutions that hold looted artifacts, bringing attention to the cultural and emotional significance of these objects. The involvement of diaspora communities in the restitution movement also highlights the global nature of this issue. People of African descent around the world feel a sense of ownership over the stolen cultural heritage of the continent. They recognize that the return of cultural property is not just a matter of national pride for the countries of origin, but a collective effort to heal the wounds of a shared history of exploitation. The African diaspora's involvement in the fight for restitution has also led to significant public awareness campaigns. Through advocacy, protests, and educational initiatives, these communities have successfully drawn international attention to the importance of returning looted artifacts. Their advocacy has pressured institutions like the British Museum, the Louvre, and other prominent museums to reconsider their positions on the repatriation of African cultural heritage. Future collaboration, Africa and global institutions. While the return of the Benin Bronzes is a remarkable achievement, it also opens the door for deeper and more meaningful collaboration between African nations and global cultural institutions. Museums in Europe and the Americas, which have historically been the custodians of African artifacts, must move beyond just repatriation to a more collaborative model that involves African stakeholders in the preservation, display, and interpretation of cultural heritage. This model of collaboration would involve African museums and cultural institutions working alongside their counterparts in the global north to create more inclusive, equitable, and culturally sensitive exhibitions. This is crucial, as many African artifacts, including the Benin Bronzes, have long been removed from their cultural context and displayed in ways that obscure their original meanings. By engaging African curators, scholars, and community leaders, museums in the West can offer a more authentic and respectful portrayal of African cultural history. Furthermore, African nations must also invest in developing their own cultural institutions. While international cooperation is essential, it is equally important for African governments to strengthen local museums, universities, and research institutions that can safeguard and study returned artifacts. This is an area where public-private partnerships, as well as international collaboration, can have a significant impact. By increasing funding for cultural institutions, African countries can create sustainable infrastructure to preserve their heritage and ensure that it benefits future generations. Cultural diplomacy and its role in global politics. The return of the Benin Bronzes serves as an example of how cultural diplomacy can play a vital role in global politics. Beyond the restitution of looted artifacts, cultural diplomacy allows nations to engage in dialogue about shared histories and collective memory. The process of repatriation is not just about objects, it is about cultural and political reconciliation. By returning the Benin Bronzes, the Netherlands has shown that cultural diplomacy can foster stronger international relationships based on mutual respect and a shared commitment to justice. Nigeria's successful restitution provides a blueprint for how other countries, particularly former colonizers, can engage in meaningful dialogues with African nations. Cultural diplomacy, as demonstrated in this case, goes beyond economic or political concerns. It addresses issues of historical trauma and the need for healing. For African countries, the return of looted artifacts is an important step in rectifying past wrongs, but it also signals a broader shift in how African nations are viewed on the global stage. The message is clear: African countries are no longer passive recipients of global culture. They are active agents in shaping the future of their cultural heritage. This shift in global cultural diplomacy is also part of the larger movement to address the legacies of colonialism, which continue to impact the political, social, and economic landscapes of many African nations. Through restitution and cultural diplomacy, African nations are asserting their rights to control their own cultural narratives and to reshape their place in the global community. The growing impact on global art markets. The repatriation of looted African artifacts has significant implications for global art markets. In recent years, the market for African art has been growing, with institutions, private collectors, and auction houses increasingly showing interest in African antiquities. However, the conversation about the return of stolen art raises questions about the ethics of this market. The growing trend of repatriation forces art collectors and dealers to reconsider the provenance of the objects they acquire. While art markets are driven by supply and demand, they must also account for the ethical considerations of acquiring objects with dubious or stolen origins. The restitution of the Benin Bronzes is just the beginning of a larger conversation about the need for greater transparency and accountability in the global art market. This shift may also prompt more rigorous documentation and verification processes for objects that are sold or displayed. The financial value of looted African art will undoubtedly be a point of contention as restitution efforts continue. As African countries reclaim their cultural heritage, the economic landscape for African art will continue to evolve, leading to more authentic and culturally respectful exchanges. The increasing pressure for museums, galleries, and auction houses to return stolen artifacts will likely cause a revaluation of the market's role in perpetuating colonial legacies. The path toward cultural justice. The return of the Benin Bronzes to Nigeria is not just a moment in history, but a catalyst for broader cultural justice movements across the African continent and the world. This victory in the struggle for repatriation serves as a reminder that cultural justice is a long-term, evolving process that requires sustained effort, collaboration, and an unwavering commitment to rectifying the historical wrongs of colonialism. Nigeria's leadership in the repatriation of the Benin Bronzes has set an important precedent, but it is only the beginning. African countries must continue to press for the return of other looted artifacts while strengthening their own cultural institutions. Global institutions, museums, and governments must engage in honest and transparent dialogues with African nations to ensure that cultural diplomacy remains at the heart of the restitution process. As we look to the future, the return of these treasures will not only enrich the cultural heritage of Nigeria, but will also inspire future generations of Africans to reclaim their history, their identity, and their place in the world. The movement for the return of cultural property is not just about artifacts. It is about restoring dignity, pride, and agency to African people and affirming the rich and diverse cultural contributions that Africa continues to make to the world. The role of education in cultural reclamation. One of the most significant aspects of the Benin Bronzes' return to Nigeria is the educational opportunities it provides for both Nigerians and the global community. education plays a crucial role in helping future generations understand the historical context of these artifacts and the injustices they represent. The return of these objects is not just an event for museum curators and diplomats, it is an opportunity for the broader public to engage with the deep cultural, historical, and social implications of colonialism and its lasting impacts. In Nigeria, the arrival of the Benin Bronzes will undoubtedly have an impact on the educational system. Schools and universities across the country can use these artifacts as teaching tools, providing students with direct access to pieces of their own cultural heritage. By incorporating the bronzes into educational curricula, Nigeria can cultivate a deeper sense of national pride, historical consciousness, and cultural identity. The objects themselves are not just works of art, they are tools for understanding history, power dynamics, and the resilience of African cultures in the face of colonial exploitation. Beyond the national level, the global significance of the Benin Bronzes requires a broader, more international educational framework. Institutions worldwide, especially those in the West, must embrace the responsibility of educating their audiences about the origins of these objects and the history of their looting. Museums that previously housed the bronzes should begin to offer comprehensive educational programs about the colonial violence that led to their removal. These programs should aim to educate visitors about the necessity of repatriation and the cultural value of restoring these artifacts to their rightful owners. Creating a collaborative global framework for restitution. The success of the Benin Bronzes restitution offers a unique opportunity to establish a more robust and coordinated international framework for the return of looted cultural property. Although the individual efforts of countries like the Netherlands and Nigeria are commendable, a global framework would help streamline the process of restitution and provide clear guidelines for the return of stolen artifacts. Such a framework would require the cooperation of international organizations, including the United Nations, UNESCO, and regional bodies like the African Union. These organizations could help facilitate communication between governments, cultural institutions, and the public, ensuring that the process is transparent and equitable. Additionally, this framework could establish a legal mechanism for addressing future claims of looted cultural property, providing a fair and impartial process for determining the rightful ownership of objects. The framework could also include provisions for cultural exchange and collaboration, ensuring that museums and institutions in both the Global South and Global North work together to preserve and protect cultural heritage. While the return of looted artifacts is crucial, the process should not be seen as a one-time event. Instead, it should be the beginning of a more inclusive and collaborative model for cultural heritage management that considers the voices and perspectives of countries of origin. The economic value of cultural restitution. The return of cultural artifacts like the Benin Bronzes also carries substantial economic potential, particularly for countries like Nigeria, which can leverage their reclaimed heritage for long-term economic benefits. Cultural heritage is increasingly seen as a powerful economic asset that can drive growth in tourism, education, and even technology. Cultural tourism is one of the fastest-growing sectors in the global economy, and the return of the Benin Bronzes provides an opportunity for Nigeria to boost its tourism industry. Museums and cultural institutions can attract international visitors interested in seeing these world-renowned artifacts in their original context. This influx of tourists can generate income for local communities, create jobs, and support the development of infrastructure around cultural sites. Beyond tourism, the repatriation of cultural artifacts has the potential to stimulate innovation in industries like art conservation, museum design, and digital heritage. Nigerian institutions will require skilled professionals in fields such as conservation science, archiving, and exhibition curation. The return of the Benin Bronzes could thus encourage the development of local expertise, creating a sustainable ecosystem around the care and exhibition of cultural property. This, in turn, could support the broader African cultural sector, helping it to compete on the global stage. Moreover, the act of repatriating cultural heritage can have a ripple effect across other sectors of the economy. It can enhance national branding and global recognition, positioning Nigeria as a leader in cultural diplomacy and heritage preservation. As African countries reclaim more of their cultural heritage, they will be able to more effectively tell their own stories, which can strengthen cultural ties within the continent and with the international community. The role of the global art market in restitution. While the repatriation of the Benin Bronzes sets an important precedent, the global art market remains a complex and often controversial terrain when it comes to the sale and display of looted cultural property. The increasing attention on the restitution of African artifacts has brought to the forefront the ethical concerns surrounding the art market's role in perpetuating the legacy of colonialism. Many of the institutions involved in the trade of African art have long faced criticism for their lack of transparency regarding the provenance of their holdings. As the conversation about restitution grows louder, the art market will likely face pressure to adopt more ethical practices. Auction houses, galleries, and private collectors must be held accountable for the proof of the objects they sell or display. This includes requiring documentation and clear evidence of an artifact's acquisition to ensure that it has not been looted or stolen. The growing movement toward repatriation will likely lead to more stringent regulations surrounding the art market, with institutions and governments working together to ensure that stolen objects are not allowed to enter the market. This may include the implementation of global standards for tracking and documenting cultural property, as well as the establishment of legal consequences for those who engage in the trade of looted artifacts. For African nations, the growing pressure on the global art market presents both challenges and opportunities. On the one hand, the market for African art could become more ethically and economically sustainable as stolen artifacts are returned and repatriated. On the other hand, African countries must continue to advocate for their own interests in the global art market, ensuring that they are not excluded from the economic benefits of their own cultural heritage. The psychological and emotional impact of repatriation. The psychological and emotional impact of repatriation on African communities cannot be overstated. For many Africans, the return of cultural artifacts is not merely a political or legal issue. It is a deeply personal matter tied to identity, memory, and a sense of collective pride. The Benin Bronzes represent the soul of the Benin Kingdom, and their return marks a symbolic victory for the African diaspora and the people of Nigeria. For the descendants of those who lived through colonial violence, the return of these artifacts is a way of rectifying a long-standing historical wrong. It is a way of acknowledging the pain and suffering caused by colonial exploitation, and, in many cases, by the loss of cultural knowledge and identity. The restitution of the Benin Bronzes, therefore, is not only a matter of material culture, but also a healing process for those who have suffered from the effects of colonialism. In the broader African context, the repatriation of cultural property represents a powerful affirmation of the resilience of African peoples and cultures. It is a reclaiming of dignity and an assertion that African history and culture are worth preserving, respecting, and celebrating. By returning these objects to Nigeria, the international community is acknowledging the inherent value of African cultures and the importance of recognizing their contributions to global heritage. Reclaiming Africa's cultural identity. The return of the Benin Bronzes is a momentous event that marks a new chapter in the history of African cultural restitution. While it is a significant achievement for Nigeria, it is also part of a larger ongoing process of reclaiming African cultural heritage. The Benin Bronzes return highlights the importance of cultural diplomacy, collaboration, and education in the quest for justice and reconciliation. However, the fight for restitution is far from over. African countries must continue to press for the return of other looted artifacts, and global institutions must remain committed to returning cultural property to its rightful owners. The legacy of colonialism remains an unresolved issue, and the repatriation of cultural heritage is just one step in addressing the broader injustices of the past. As more African nations reclaim their cultural treasures, they will not only restore their rightful ownership, but also reshape the global understanding of African history and culture. The return of the Benin Bronzes is a powerful reminder that cultural heritage is not merely a collection of objects, but a living, evolving part of a people's identity and history. Through continued efforts for repatriation and cultural collaboration, the world can move toward a more just and inclusive future for all. The role of technology in cultural restitution. As the movement for the return of looted cultural artifacts continues to gain momentum, technology is emerging as a powerful ally in facilitating the restitution process. Modern technology can play a significant role in tracking and verifying the provenance of artifacts, ensuring transparency in the ownership of cultural property, and improving the preservation of returned objects. These tools will not only assist in the repatriation process, but also provide African nations with the resources they need to protect their cultural heritage for future generations. For example, digitization of cultural artifacts has become a growing trend in museums worldwide. By creating high-quality digital replicas of artifacts, countries can preserve and display their cultural heritage without the physical risks of damage, theft, or deterioration. The digitization process also enables the global public to engage with African cultural objects in ways that were previously impossible. Through virtual tours, interactive exhibitions, and online databases, people around the world can explore African heritage without leaving their homes. Moreover, digitization allows African institutions to create virtual museums and exhibitions, which can be shared globally. This can lead to greater recognition and appreciation of African history and culture. It is an important step in shifting the narrative from Africa being a passive recipient of cultural objects to actively engaging with and sharing its history with the world. In terms of tracking provenance, blockchain technology is an emerging tool that could revolutionize the way cultural objects are documented and traced. Blockchain offers a secure, transparent, and immutable method for recording the ownership and movement of cultural objects. By using blockchain, African countries can create a verifiable record of their cultural property, making it easier to assert ownership and prevent illicit trafficking. Technology also offers African countries a means to modernize their cultural institutions. Digital platforms can help African museums and cultural organizations manage collections, track artifacts, and reach wider audiences. These advancements will not only aid in the restitution process, but also contribute to the long-term sustainability of African cultural heritage management. Furthermore, collaboration with international experts using technology for conservation and preservation can help ensure that these artifacts are properly cared for once they return to their home countries. The political dimensions of cultural reclamation. While the return of the Benin Bronzes to Nigeria is a diplomatic success, it also has significant political implications. The restitution of cultural property challenges the very foundations of colonial power dynamics that persist in global institutions today. For many African nations, the return of these artifacts is not only a matter of cultural pride, but also an assertion of political agency. The act of reclaiming looted heritage is a challenge to the legacy of colonial exploitation and a demand for the recognition of African nations as equal partners in the global community. Cultural restitution is a political issue, one that intersects with larger discussions about reparations, the redistribution of wealth, and the acknowledgement of historical wrongs. The return of the Benin Bronzes is part of a broader political movement that includes calls for reparations for the economic exploitation of African nations during colonialism. It is also tied to the struggle for African self-determination and the recognition of the continent's cultural and political autonomy. The restitution process can have a ripple effect on political relations between African nations and former colonial powers. The Benin Bronzes return is a symbol of the evolving relationship between Africa and Europe, one that acknowledges the past injustices while also fostering new opportunities for cooperation and mutual respect. This could have profound implications for diplomatic relations, as African countries may push for more reparations and cultural restitution, while former colonial powers may seek to rebuild trust and strengthen their relationships with African nations. However, the restitution of cultural property is not without its political challenges. In some cases, governments and institutions may resist returning artifacts, citing concerns over legal frameworks, security, or the potential for damaging the artifact's historical context. The repatriation of cultural property often requires navigating complex international law and the interests of various stakeholders, including museums, collectors, and governments. As African nations continue to advocate for the return of looted artifacts, they will need to engage in ongoing diplomatic negotiations, leveraging political alliances and global support to ensure that their claims are heard and respected. This ongoing process is a reminder that cultural restitution is not just about returning objects. It is about asserting Africa's right to control its cultural and historical narratives, both at home and on the global stage. The global impact, reconciliation, and healing. The restitution of the Benin Bronzes also carries significant potential for global reconciliation and healing. As more looted artifacts are returned to their countries of origin, the process will become an essential part of the broader movement for justice, equality, and healing. The global community's collective efforts to acknowledge the wrongs of the past and work toward restoring cultural heritage can play a crucial role in fostering mutual understanding and respect. Restitution is not only an act of cultural reclaiming but also a process of social healing. The Benin Bronzes are emblematic of the violent history of colonialism and the trauma inflicted on African nations by foreign powers. Returning these artifacts is an important step toward healing the psychological wounds caused by centuries of exploitation, violence, and cultural erasure. For many Africans, the return of these artifacts represents an opportunity to reclaim lost histories, affirm their cultural identities, and begin the process of healing from colonial trauma. As countries around the world face the legacies of slavery and colonialism, restitution provides a path forward, one that prioritizes justice, respect, and reconciliation. The process is not about erasing the past, but confronting it head-on, acknowledging the suffering that was caused, and working together to build a more inclusive and equitable future. For former colonial powers, participating in the restitution of cultural property is an important step in reckoning with the colonial past and demonstrating a commitment to building more equitable global relations. This is an opportunity for countries like the United Kingdom, France, and the Netherlands to demonstrate their commitment to cultural diplomacy and international cooperation. Reconciliation through restitution can help address the grievances of colonized peoples, offering a way to heal historical wounds and build stronger, more respectful relationships with former colonies. The psychological impact on African identity. The repatriation of the Benin Bronzes has a profound psychological impact on the collective identity of the Nigerian people and, more broadly, the African diaspora. For decades, these priceless cultural treasures were taken from their rightful home, disrupting not only the physical preservation of cultural property, but also the psychological connection that people have with their heritage. By returning the Benin Bronzes, a deep connection to African history, art, and identity is re-established. The impact of this restitution is far-reaching. For generations, Africans have been disconnected from the objects that tell the story of their ancestors. The return of these artifacts is a step toward healing the fractured sense of identity that has been a byproduct of colonial exploitation. It represents a reclamation of African dignity and the right to define and preserve one's cultural heritage. For the descendants of those who were affected by colonial violence, the return of these artifacts is a source of pride and emotional healing. It is a reminder that, despite the destruction caused by colonialism, African cultures have endured and continue to thrive. The Benin Bronzes serve as a testament to the resilience of the African spirit, and their return signals that the African story is still being written, one that centers the experiences, achievements, and histories of the people who call the continent home. A road ahead. While the return of the Benin Bronzes represents a significant victory for Nigeria and the broader African continent, it is only the beginning of a longer, more complex journey toward full restitution of Africa's cultural heritage. The global momentum for the return of looted artifacts is growing, and as more nations reclaim their cultural treasures, the world will witness an evolution in how history is told and remembered. The process of restitution is not just about returning objects. It is about restoring a sense of dignity, reclaiming cultural identities, and addressing the lasting scars of colonialism. It is about creating a future where Africa's contributions to global history, culture, and civilization are respected, celebrated, and preserved for future generations. As this movement continues to unfold, the Benin Bronzes will stand as a symbol of hope, unity, and the power of cultural reclamation. They represent the triumph of justice over colonial oppression and the potential for healing, reconciliation, and renewal. In the coming years, the conversation around cultural restitution will continue to grow, shaping the future of museums, diplomacy, education, and the global art market. Through continued advocacy, international cooperation, and a commitment to justice, the world can begin to move toward a more equitable and inclusive future, one where the cultural heritage of all peoples is respected and protected. The role of media in shaping the restitution narrative. As the world increasingly turns its attention to the return of looted African cultural heritage, the role of media in shaping the narrative around restitution cannot be overstated. Media outlets, whether through traditional channels like television, radio, and newspapers, or newer platforms such as social media, have the power to influence public opinion, hold institutions accountable, and elevate global conversations about justice and equity. The Benin Bronzes' return to Nigeria has been widely covered, both in African and international media. These reports have brought greater visibility to the ongoing efforts of African countries to recover their cultural property and have served to educate the public about the historical injustices involved. As media continues to spotlight the significance of cultural restitution, it will help to shift the narrative away from the idea of African heritage as universal property and towards the understanding that cultural objects belong to the communities and nations from which they originated. Journalistic coverage plays a critical role in raising awareness and fostering conversations about the broader implications of cultural restitution. Through in-depth reporting, documentaries, interviews with scholars, cultural leaders, and affected communities, the media can bring to light the emotional, cultural, and political stakes of repatriation. Stories about the personal impact of the Benin Bronzes' return, for instance, can humanize the struggle and illustrate the ongoing relevance of cultural restitution to contemporary African identities and political agendas. Social media has become a powerful tool for activists and institutions alike. Movements such as Benin Bronzes Return, Repatriate African Artifacts, and others have gained significant traction, amplifying the voices of those calling for the return of looted heritage. These hashtags and online campaigns have sparked widespread discussions about colonialism, restitution, and African sovereignty, helping to bring these issues into the global consciousness in a way that traditional media often cannot. The power of digital platforms to connect people across borders means that Africans in the diaspora are also actively involved in the advocacy for repatriation, creating a truly global movement for cultural justice. As the media narrative evolves, it is important that African voices remain at the center of this conversation. While Western media outlets have covered the story of the Benin Bronzes' return, African journalists, scholars, and cultural leaders should continue to have a prominent role in shaping how these events are framed. This will ensure that the story is told from the perspective of those most affected, those whose cultures were violated and whose heritage was looted, and that the narratives of resistance, resilience, and recovery are highlighted. Legal challenges and reforms in restitution law. Another crucial area in the ongoing effort for the return of looted cultural property is the legal framework surrounding restitution. Although the Benin Bronzes' return from the Netherlands marks a significant victory, the process of repatriation remains complex and fraught with legal hurdles, particularly when dealing with museums and private collections that may hold artifacts without clear provenance. International law surrounding cultural restitution is still in development, while various conventions, such as the 1970 UNESCO Convention, aim to prevent the illicit trafficking of cultural property. Many of these laws have been difficult to enforce. Restitution laws also vary from country to country, and the lack of a unified global standard often creates discrepancies in how cultural property claims are handled. While African countries have increasingly asserted their rights to repatriate looted heritage, they must navigate complex international legal frameworks that were not designed to address the historical wrongs of colonialism. One of the challenges in pursuing restitution lies in the concept of ownership. Western museums often defend the idea that they legally acquired these artifacts through trade, donation, or legitimate purchase. These claims, however, are complicated by the context in which these objects were taken, through force, deceit, or coercion. Thus, a key issue is whether contemporary ownership of these objects can truly be deemed legitimate when the circumstances surrounding their acquisition were rooted in exploitation and violence. As African countries continue to seek the return of their cultural heritage, it will be necessary to develop new legal frameworks that prioritize justice and equity. These frameworks must recognize the historical context of these artifacts' removal and consider the enduring impact of colonialism on African societies. In the case of the Benin Bronzes, the Dutch government and museums have taken the important step of acknowledging the unlawful nature of the artifacts' acquisition, which has paved the way for their return. Similar legal precedents must be set in other restitution cases to ensure that the principles of justice and fairness guide the return process. The African Union, AU, could play a significant role in developing a continental legal framework for cultural restitution. Such a framework would allow African countries to present a unified front when advocating for the return of looted heritage, facilitating cooperation among nations, and strengthening their collective bargaining power. International legal experts, African cultural leaders, and policymakers should collaborate to create clear guidelines for handling restitution cases, ensuring that all African countries have the tools they need to assert their rights to their cultural property. The psychological impact of cultural repatriation on the global stage. As more cultural artifacts are returned to their countries of origin, the psychological effects on the African continent, the countries involved, and the world at large will continue to unfold. The repatriation of cultural heritage is not just a political or legal issue, it is a deeply personal and emotional one. For Africans, the return of stolen cultural treasures represents a reclaiming of identity and history, a chance to rebuild the connection to their ancestors and cultural traditions that were disrupted by colonial violence. For many Nigerians, the return of the Benin Bronzes has profound symbolic significance. These objects are more than just pieces of art. They are the embodiments of the history and cultural pride of the Benin Kingdom. Their removal from Benin City in 1897 during the British invasion was not only a theft of physical objects, but a violent severing of a community's link to its past. The Benin Bronzes' return is, therefore, an act of healing and reconnection. It allows Nigerians to reaffirm their identity and take ownership of their history in a way that has been denied to them for over a century. The psychological impact extends beyond Nigeria, affecting African diasporas around the world. Many members of the African diaspora have long felt disconnected from the cultural heritage that was taken during the colonial era. The return of these artifacts serves as a powerful reminder that the struggles of African peoples are not confined to the past, but continue to shape the present and future. It also reinforces the idea that Africa has always been a hub of creativity, innovation, and culture, contributions that have often been overshadowed by the history of colonialism and exploitation. The return of the Benin Bronzes could also influence the global perception of Africa. For decades, the narrative surrounding Africa's cultural contributions has been dominated by stereotypes and misconceptions. Repatriation helps to shift this narrative, offering the world a more nuanced understanding of African history and culture. As African nations continue to assert their right to their cultural heritage, They challenge the notion that Western nations are the rightful guardians of these treasures. In doing so, they open new possibilities for the global understanding of African culture and its place in the broader history of humanity. The continued relevance of Pan-Africanism in cultural restitution. The return of the Benin Bronzes is also significant within the context of Pan-Africanism, the movement for the political, economic, and cultural unity of African nations. The repatriation of these artifacts is a powerful symbol of African unity and solidarity, demonstrating that when African nations work together, they can achieve meaningful change. Pan-Africanism has long been concerned with reclaiming African identity and culture, which were severely undermined during the colonial period. The return of looted artifacts is in line with the Pan-African vision of rebuilding African cultural pride and sovereignty. The Benin Bronzes return demonstrates the power of collective action and diplomacy, particularly as African countries continue to press for the return of their cultural heritage from former colonial powers. As the Benin Bronzes are returned to Nigeria, other African nations will undoubtedly draw inspiration from this achievement. Pan-African organizations and networks will continue to play a crucial role in organizing collective efforts for cultural restitution, helping African countries leverage their collective strength to reclaim their cultural property. The future of Pan-Africanism in cultural restitution is closely tied to the broader movement for justice and reparations. By uniting around the common cause of cultural reclamation, African countries can strengthen their political and cultural influence on the global stage. As more artifacts are returned, African nations can use these cultural treasures as powerful tools for diplomacy and cultural exchange, creating a space for Africa to reassert its place in world history and culture, a world shaped by cultural justice. The return of the Benin Bronzes is more than just a historical event. It is a symbol of the potential for cultural justice to reshape global relations. It is an affirmation that African nations can reclaim their cultural heritage and reassert control over their historical narratives. However, this is just the beginning, and the ongoing process of restitution will continue to unfold over the coming years. The road to full restitution is complex and challenging, but the efforts of African nations, in partnership with international organizations, legal experts, and cultural leaders, will ensure that more cultural treasures are returned to their rightful owners. By continuing to advocate for cultural justice, Africa is not just reclaiming objects, it is reclaiming its dignity, identity, and agency in a global context. The return of the Benin Bronzes, along with the growing momentum for repatriation, signals a new era of cultural diplomacy where the world's history is viewed through a more equitable and inclusive lens. As the global community works together to address the wrongs of the past, the future will be shaped by a recognition of the value and significance of all cultures. Africa's rich cultural heritage is an integral part of this future, and the continued efforts to restore its treasures will ensure that the continent's legacy is preserved for generations to come. Strengthening cultural heritage preservation in Africa. As the Benin Bronzes and other cultural artifacts are repatriated, the importance of preserving these treasures once they return to their countries of origin cannot be overstated. Nigeria, alongside other African nations involved in similar restitution efforts, will need to develop robust systems to ensure the proper care, conservation, and protection of these cultural assets. In this context, there is a growing recognition of the need to invest in cultural heritage infrastructure and human resources to safeguard these objects for future generations. The preservation of returned cultural property is a multifaceted challenge that requires both technological innovation and traditional expertise. In many African countries, the infrastructure needed to protect and conserve artifacts is often lacking, and museums are not always equipped to handle the complex demands of conservation. To address this, African nations must invest in modern conservation techniques, digital archiving, and exhibition facilities that meet international standards. In addition to physical infrastructure, there is also a need to build human capacity. The training of conservators, curators, archaeologists, and other museum professionals is essential to ensure that cultural heritage is maintained in the best possible condition. Collaborations with international institutions, universities, and museums that specialize in conservation can provide African professionals with the skills and knowledge needed to manage and protect their heritage. These partnerships are vital in ensuring that returned artifacts are preserved in a manner that respects both their cultural significance and their historical context. Moreover, African countries must also prioritize security to prevent the theft, destruction, or illegal sale of returned artifacts. Given the high value of these objects, they remain targets for illicit trade and trafficking. National and international efforts must be made to increase security measures in museums and cultural sites, implementing modern surveillance technologies and other protective measures to safeguard these cultural treasures. Additionally, African governments must work closely with global law enforcement agencies to prevent the illegal export and trafficking of cultural artifacts. Digital technology is also an essential tool in preserving African cultural heritage. Digitizing the Benin Bronzes and other cultural artifacts allows for their conservation in a virtual space, while still enabling widespread access and educational opportunities. High-resolution imaging and 3D modeling can provide museums, researchers, and the public with the ability to study artifacts remotely, reducing the risk of physical damage during handling. Digitization also allows for the creation of digital archives that can be accessed by scholars, students, and the public, further enhancing the global visibility of African culture. The role of African art and culture in shaping global narratives. The return of the Benin Bronzes is not just about recovering objects. It is about reshaping global narratives about African art, culture, and history. For too long, African cultural achievements have been marginalized in mainstream global discussions. Colonialism, both in practice and in its legacy, contributed to the erasure of Africa's rich cultural contributions and placed Western culture at the center of the global narrative. The repatriation of cultural objects like the Benin Bronzes serves as a direct challenge to these narratives, reasserting Africa's rightful place as a cultural and historical powerhouse. As African nations continue to recover and showcase their cultural treasures, they have an opportunity to redefine how the world views African art and history. The Benin Bronzes, with their intricate craftsmanship and deep cultural significance, are not just relics of the past. They are vital symbols of African creativity, resilience, and ingenuity. Their return to Nigeria provides a chance to tell African stories from an African perspective, moving beyond the colonial interpretation that has often been imposed on these artifacts. African art and culture have long influenced global aesthetics, whether through the movements of the Harlem Renaissance in the United States, the rise of Afrofuturism in contemporary art, or the global popularity of African fashion and music. The return of cultural artifacts strengthens this ongoing cultural renaissance by providing tangible connections to Africa's past, present, and future. In doing so, it challenges the outdated perceptions of Africa as a continent without history, innovation, or civilization, and highlights its contributions to the world's cultural heritage. The impact on Africa's soft power and diplomacy. Cultural diplomacy plays an increasingly important role in shaping the relationships between African nations and the rest of the world. The return of the Benin Bronzes and other cultural artifacts strengthens Africa's soft power, its ability to influence global perceptions, and engage in international diplomacy through culture. This form of diplomacy is more than just about recovering lost heritage. It's a tool for fostering stronger international relations based on mutual respect, shared history, and cultural exchange. As African countries reclaim their cultural property, they enhance their diplomatic leverage on the global stage. Cultural diplomacy allows African nations to move beyond dependency and exert influence over global conversations surrounding historical injustices, human rights, and the need for equity in international relations. The repatriation of African cultural heritage is a powerful symbol of the continent's growing influence and its commitment to shaping a more just and inclusive global order. Additionally, the return of artifacts provides African nations with new opportunities for cultural exchange, collaboration, and investment. With the repatriation of the Benin Bronzes, Nigeria has the chance to foster partnerships with other nations, particularly in the fields of tourism, education, and research. These partnerships can create mutually beneficial opportunities that strengthen diplomatic ties and contribute to the development of African cultural industries. By engaging with international museums, universities, and cultural institutions, African nations can not only protect their cultural heritage, but also promote their unique cultural contributions to the world. This engagement enables African countries to assert their role as leaders in global cultural conversations and positions them to shape future discussions on topics such as reparations, colonialism, and cultural exchange. The broader implications for global reconciliation. The return of the Benin Bronzes is a significant step in the broader movement for global reconciliation, particularly in addressing the long-lasting effects of colonialism. The return of looted cultural property acknowledges the harm caused by colonial exploitation and begins the process of repairing the relationships between former colonial powers and African nations. The restitution of artifacts is a tangible way of recognizing and rectifying the historical injustices that continue to affect Africa today. Reconciliation, however, goes beyond the return of material objects. It requires addressing the broader structural inequalities that stem from the colonial period and continue to shape global power dynamics. For African countries, the return of cultural treasures symbolizes the need for more equitable relationships, not just in cultural exchanges, but in all aspects of global engagement, be it trade, diplomacy, or development. The process of reconciliation must involve listening to the voices of those who have been historically marginalized and ensuring that they are active participants in shaping the future. The repatriation of cultural heritage is a step in the right direction, but it must be accompanied by broader efforts to address the socio-economic challenges faced by African nations due to the exploitation they suffered during the colonial era. As more artifacts are returned to Africa, the international community must recognize the significance of these actions and continue to engage in dialogue that centers on justice, reparations, and historical truth. These discussions will be crucial in healing the wounds of the past and building a more equitable and just global order. The intersection of technology, culture, and identity. The intersection of technology, culture, and identity is becoming increasingly important in the modern age, and the return of the Benin Bronzes highlights how these areas are linked. As African countries gain control over their cultural heritage, they are also embracing new technologies to enhance their preservation and understanding of that heritage. Digital tools, from 3D modeling to virtual exhibitions, are helping African institutions protect and promote their cultural treasures in innovative ways. The use of technology in preserving and presenting cultural heritage also plays a significant role in reinforcing African identities. The digital platforms that showcase African artifacts allow people around the world, including those in the diaspora, to connect with their roots in ways that were previously unimaginable. These tools also make African cultural narratives more accessible and engaging to younger generations, fostering a sense of pride and connection to their heritage. As the world becomes more interconnected through technology, the possibilities for cultural exchange and understanding are vast. African nations are well positioned to use technology not just for the preservation of artifacts, but for the promotion of their culture on a global stage. By harnessing the power of digital technology, African countries can ensure that their cultural narratives are shared, respected, and understood worldwide, while also giving future generations the tools to explore their heritage in new and meaningful ways. Embracing the future of cultural restitution. The return of the Benin Bronzes represents a significant milestone in the ongoing struggle for the restitution of looted African cultural heritage. It is a reminder that the fight for justice, equity, and reconciliation is far from over, but it also marks the beginning of a new era in the relationship between African nations and the global community. As more African countries recover their stolen cultural treasures, the world will increasingly come to recognize the importance of preserving and respecting Africa's rich cultural heritage. This journey is not just about returning artifacts, it is about reclaiming identity, restoring dignity, and creating a global narrative that reflects the true history and culture of Africa. With continued diplomatic efforts, investment in cultural infrastructure, and engagement with global institutions, African countries can ensure that their cultural heritage is preserved, celebrated, and shared with the world for generations to come. In the years ahead, the global conversation about cultural restitution will continue to evolve, and Africa will play a central role in shaping that conversation. By embracing the future of cultural restitution and fostering a spirit of collaboration, African nations can ensure that their cultural heritage is not just reclaimed, but also celebrated and respected on the global stage. Through this process, Africa's rightful place in world history will continue to be reaffirmed, and the global community will be reminded of the power and resilience of African cultures. Leveraging cultural repatriation for broader socio-political change. As African countries continue to recover their cultural heritage, it is essential for African leaders to recognize the broader socio-political benefits that cultural restitution can bring. While the return of artifacts, like the Benin Bronzes, is undoubtedly a victory for cultural justice, it can also serve as a catalyst for broader political and economic reforms that can enhance the well-being of African societies. The symbolic return of looted heritage offers African leaders the opportunity to connect with their people and demonstrate a commitment to national pride, unity, and empowerment. The act of reclaiming cultural property can become a tool for advocating more comprehensive reforms, including addressing issues like corruption, governance, and economic development. African leaders can leverage the momentum of cultural restitution to push for policies that prioritize education, healthcare, and infrastructure development, all of which are vital to the prosperity of African nations. By framing the repatriation of cultural heritage within the broader context of socio-political change, leaders can inspire a new sense of purpose and direction for their nations. Cultural restitution also plays a crucial role in shifting the global narrative around Africa, showing that the continent is not just a victim of historical exploitation, but a dynamic force capable of shaping its own future. This shift in perception is necessary for Africa to reclaim its rightful place in global geopolitics. Through cultural diplomacy and the return of stolen heritage, African nations can challenge outdated stereotypes, assert their agency, and foster stronger international relationships based on mutual respect and shared interests. Strategic collaboration and future prospects. As African countries continue their journey toward cultural restitution, strategic collaboration with international partners is essential. While African leaders should prioritize their own cultural sovereignty, they must also work closely with global institutions, museums, and governments to ensure that the repatriation process is carried out in a transparent and fair manner. Bilateral agreements, legal frameworks, and diplomatic channels will be key in facilitating the return of looted artifacts, as well as in ensuring the ongoing protection and preservation of these objects once they are returned. The process of repatriation is not solely about the return of physical objects, it is also about the broader concept of cultural restitution and the healing of historical wounds. African leaders should encourage their governments to create an environment in which open dialogue, education, and cultural exchange are promoted. This will not only facilitate the return of looted cultural property, but also create opportunities for long-term international cooperation in various fields such as technology, education, and trade. Furthermore, African leaders must invest in developing the infrastructure needed to protect their cultural heritage, including world-class museums, conservation centers, and educational institutions. These investments are not just about preserving the past, but also about creating a sustainable future for African culture. Leaders should work to build networks of African scholars, artists, and curators who can contribute to the interpretation, management, and promotion of their heritage, both at home and abroad. Advice to African leaders. African leaders must embrace the return of cultural artifacts as a powerful tool for reclaiming Africa's history, culture, and identity. However, they must approach this opportunity with a long-term vision that connects cultural restitution to broader national and continental development goals. Cultural heritage is not merely a reflection of the past, it is a key component of Africa's future. Leaders must ensure that the repatriated artifacts are integrated into national narratives that promote unity, national pride, and socio-economic progress. In addition, African leaders should engage in continuous dialogue with their citizens, ensuring that they understand the importance of cultural restitution and its potential to strengthen Africa's global standing. By involving local communities, artists, and academics in the process of repatriation, leaders can foster a sense of collective ownership and pride. This approach will help to build strong support for future restitution efforts and ensure that the returned artifacts are properly cared for and appreciated. Furthermore, African leaders must remain steadfast in their commitment to justice, both in the context of cultural restitution and broader political reforms. The fight for repatriation is part of a larger struggle to ensure that African nations are treated with dignity, respect, and equality in the international arena. Leaders should continue to advocate for fair treatment in all aspects of international relations and strive for a future where Africa is no longer on the periphery of global discussions, but is a central and influential voice in shaping the world's political, cultural, and economic future. Summary of key messages. The return of the Benin Bronzes marks a transformative moment in Africa's journey of cultural reclamation and justice. This historic development represents the power of diplomacy, international collaboration, and the growing recognition of African nations' rights to their cultural heritage. The repatriation of cultural artifacts challenges colonial legacies, providing African nations with the opportunity to reconnect with their past, assert their cultural identity, and build stronger, more equitable relationships on the global stage. However, cultural restitution is not a one-off achievement. It is part of an ongoing movement that requires strategic planning, collaboration, and investment in cultural infrastructure. African leaders must continue to prioritize the protection and preservation of their cultural heritage, while using the momentum of cultural restitution to drive broader socio-political and economic reforms. In doing so, they will not only ensure that African cultural treasures are preserved for future generations, but also pave the way for a more just and inclusive global order. The process of reclaiming Africa's cultural heritage is ultimately about restoring dignity, pride, and ownership of history. African leaders must seize this opportunity to unite their people around the shared goal of cultural sovereignty, creating a future where African nations are not only the custodians of their cultural heritage, but also the architects of their own future. The continued fight for repatriation is about more than objects. It is about the reclamation of Africa's place in world history and the celebration of its rich cultural legacy. Thank you for watching this important discussion on the return of the Benin Bronzes to Nigeria. This victory symbolizes not only the reclamation of artifacts, but also a broader movement for cultural sovereignty across Africa. Don't forget to hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. We'll continue to bring you insightful analysis of the latest news, critical comparisons, and forward-looking perspectives. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on the Bold African Voice, BAV.